I want to talk about a very important moment and a very important point on the dial of sympathy and antipathy towards life. So, at any given moment, there are things happening in our lives that are negative, that bring pain and suffering. And the innate drive of every human being to feel sustainably better and avoid feeling chronically worse leads to a desire to engage at some level with life or avoid engaging with life based on that set point. Because there are parts of our lives, there are thoughts, there are feelings, there are physical sensations, and there are perceptions of reality that elevate suffering. And there are thoughts, feelings, sensations, perceptions of life that bring well-being. And in order to move towards life on an instinctive level, we need to have a perception primarily that moving towards life brings well-being. Without that perception, being more aware, more attuned, more awake, more present, thinking about, looking at life brings suffering. And a lot of this has to do with the projection in the future, the projection about the future. So to the extent that we are in pain and expect that pain to continue and feel impotent to resolve that pain is to the extent that we will want to numb out, diffuse, avoid, tune out to life, sensation, our mind, and the future. And I say all that because for a number of years, looking at my life led to an elevation of pain. Examining thoughts increased pain. Looking at the future increased pain. Being in my body increased pain to such a degree that I noticed myself losing memory, as an example, to dull down pain. Not looking too far at the future, not examining possible change, and simply retreating through anesthetics, compulsive thinking, compulsive feeling, compulsive sensing, avoiding. That in a sense, to the degree that I got fully into my body, I found myself literally overwhelmed almost violently with the unpleasant sensation of having to be here in this body, in this mind, with these feelings, in this life. And so the pivot point that I've been noticing over the past few days is that that dial has shifted, meaning that the future is now more exciting than the present. Now, this is an incredibly important shift because to the extent that the future is projected to be worse than an unpleasant present, in an impotent state, there is no basis to intelligently pursue one's drive to feel sustainably better by being more aware, by engaging more. And that has shifted. I want to talk a lot about some of those shifts and why this is such a significant moment. So, the sexual abuse by Peter Sandhill and the Human Awareness Institute continued to unfold in a negative direction, meaning the more I tried to do something about that, the more reality confirmed for me that life would get more disappointing, more painful, more negative than if I did nothing, which was a state of pain. The idea of a future of apathy and avoiding problems was painful. The idea of confronting problems and having them get worse was painful. And being in unresolved problems was painful. And that pain reached an unimaginably, for me some years ago, high pitch. When all of this blew up and I developed symptoms of PTSD, my well-being deteriorated hundreds of percent past my prior pain points. So if one looks at one's framework of referencing pain, you look at the worst possible pain you've ever known, and you look at the best possible moments of pleasure that you've ever known. And you have a continuum from idyllic to horrific. Well, my negative continuum was blown open by hundreds of percent. And everything I tried to do that seemed to be the most direct, rational response to right that situation made things worse, added disappointment. If you've ever tried to confront sexual abuse in a shadow-averse culture, in a traumatically illiterate culture, the way that the majority of people respond in that situation is less than idyllic, always, and sometimes horrendous, meaning that if we created a parallel scenario where you've suddenly been run over by a truck and you're now paralyzed under the wheels of that truck. Well, if you wriggle around, there's no way to lift the weight of the truck off your body. And if you call for help and the response is, "Ew, that's blood, I don't want to see that," and you desperately need help, that is a traumatic realization, to understand that when you need help the most is when people will avoid the situation. This is a crisis because you can't get out of that truck without support. And if the response is universally to withdraw and avoid the need for support, then there's two equally horrendous conclusions. Well, there's three actually. One is I can be in tremendous pain in which no one is willing to help and pretend that I'm in a loving world, when the reality is tremendous bitterness and a sense of betrayal. Or I can stay in a state which I can't get out of, in the knowledge that I cannot get out of it, with an 18-wheel truck crushing my back, in tremendous pain, and know that that could get worse or better, because typically in these blind spots in a culture, those types of things get worse. Maybe the truck drives forward and drives over you again with the other wheel, because the crisis, the trauma, is not being recognized and processed intelligently. It's an occult blind spot. Or the other is that I can continue to ask for help and perhaps be yanked without the acknowledgement that there's an 18-wheel truck over my back. You don't want that kind of help. If you're ever with a crushed back in an 18-wheel truck over your body around people who do not understand the laws of physics. Asking for help is dangerous. If they yank you and sever further spinal cohesion, they're making it worse. If they say, be positive and get up out of that truck, it's incredibly maddening. Because if you could get out from under an 18-wheel truck while you weigh 200 pounds and you're dealing with several tons of weight on your body, you would have done it. And so there's a dissociation and insanity that it becomes mind-bending insanity creation to try and grapple with the response, leading to the inevitable conclusion either that people do not care, which is escalating psychological pain, or that they are dangerous in a level of ignorance that makes getting out from that situation just incredibly precarious. And it reminds me a little bit about moving heavy objects or trying to get something really difficult done with people that do not understand the risks and the variables. And in those situations, I ask those people to stay at least 10 feet away. Do not lend a hand and topple a heavy object over because you don't know what you're doing. And when this includes the experts, the psychologists, the trauma therapists, etc., it creates a dark dissociation that would be humorous except for the fact that there's 300% more pain than I've ever felt before. Now, in this state of high pain and high incompetence, it's incredibly normal, natural, and instinctive to be impatient, to be belligerent, to be sarcastic and rude, because it is incredibly hostile, incredibly cruel, incredibly impatient producing to be in that state surrounded with a certain level of incompetence. It's almost impossible to put into words. And so I've been in that crevice for a number of years. And it's a multidimensional experience, meaning there is a certain part of my psyche that is under that bus. And there are other parts of my psyche that are untethered from that particular thing. And so one survival strategy is to dissociate with the parts that are stuck and associate with the parts that can still function. So this was an approach, and I would call it a survival-based, rational, strategic survival response. And so from that position, with what I could do, I took step after step after step that seemed like it would move the parts of me that could still move forward into a reality where the parts of me that could still move could be of more use to the parts of me that were still stuck under the bus. And so thus began 1,000 hours of traumatic research. So the mind could go off and read and read and read and listen and watch and read and listen and develop a model for understanding what was going on that I didn't have before. because part of the problem of being born into a traumatically illiterate culture and propelled with the force of an explosion, in this case amplified by the potency of psychedelics, which you can see somewhat as a bottle rocket. But if the bottle rocket can't take off because it's held, at the stick in the ground, all that energy creates smoke, creates an ultimate explosion, and it doesn't take you airborne because there's a lack of science, there's a lack of understanding about that situation. Then all energy, when it's poorly attuned, leads to further disaster, and more energy is actually not good. If you're hitting someone with a car, for example, and you've got a lot of power and a lot of torque, that's not good. You don't want an amplification of an energy deployment if you haven't gotten your direction and your model correct. You don't want to go at 200 miles per hour into the tree. You don't want to go at 200 miles an hour at all until you know where you're going with a protocol that will take you there safely. And then that rocket fuel will open up the horizon very successfully. So that exploration, that moving out from self to create a reality that the stuck self, that the self in PTSD could not deal with, has taken a number of different forms. One of them was a pivot from asking for my 100%, which didn't result in receiving that 100%, to giving my 100%. In this case, being of service to a young woman who is now my wife, and using the monetary resources, the mental resources available to me to get her out of the particular nightmare she was in when I met her. And that was the first success, because her reality and her well-being went up thousands of percent logistically, thousands of percent educationally, and hundreds of percent in sustainable felt well-being. The life skill development that has occurred in that relationship, in the thousands of percent in added life skills, etc., has taken this young woman from Philippines to Thailand to the United States to marriage, into one career, and then hiring her myself and developing her into the foreman for my landscape contracting business, which now sees her able to do a better job than I do with crew management. It's very hard to be relaxed with people in a state of PTSD. But by healing the trauma in her world with a steady set of incremental, sustainable protocols, and replacing that helplessness with confidence, with power, with independence, with skills, with wealth, she does a fabulous job dealing with people, which in turn builds more cohesive relationships. And so the indirect cohesive nature of relationships has expanded by several 100%. Simultaneously, she is more honest than honest and loyal than my crew before, which was exploiting this situation with theft and embezzlement, etc., to boost profits in the company, which provides a baseline of survival and security of survival. So that's one journey. Simultaneously, the personas, the identities that developed in me in direct response to the PTSD, the betrayal, etc., were very difficult identities for others to deal with. And as a result of the betrayal, the rejection, etc., my sense of being acceptable and lovable plummeted. And through being in service to this young woman, in a protocol of love that I would articulate as caring enough to see, seeing enough to understand, understanding enough to empathize, empathizing enough to attune, attuning successfully enough to succeed at facilitating the realization of her own unique individual beauty through climbing Maslow's hierarchy of needs of survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem, the development of gifts, bringing those gifts out into the world with honor, and becoming part of something bigger than oneself. She has made that ascent in a stable, rapid, and continuing process of moving towards adulthood. It's very difficult to move out of the childlike identities of victim and trauma when you are being victimized by forces bigger than you can control. And so simply by consciously behaving in a way that saw her progressing in that way, that is a form of adult love that transcends the child love of attachment, the adolescent love of lust, into the adult love of being of service. And love does lead to love. It is a virus. If you will take anyone in your life and care about them enough to see them, which takes time, taking the time to see them, the time to understand, the time to empathize, the time to attune, the time to succeed and get feedback, and then support them in climbing Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Gratitude, joy, pleasure, trust, a sense of intimacy, emerges. And so as that relationship has blossomed, all the time doing it in service, in a sense that, we had numerous conversations along the way about helping her date other men if she wanted to, helping her have her own career if she wanted to, giving her the freedom to leave the relationship, in a sustainable way. As each of those opportunities and offerings were rejected in favor of growing our relationship from a place of independence and freedom, that lovability and acceptability has climbed by the felt daily experience of making someone very happy, making someone feel very grateful, making someone blossom before my eyes, and associating that with my impact. And so that lovability has ascended as the survival, security, etc. It was a somewhat tenuous arc because I was very incapacitated, and it cost more than $200,000 to manage the visa process, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's not love if it isn't free. And so there was absolutely no expectation or guarantee that that would pay off, that would boomerang back to me. But it has. And as it has, my sense of safety, survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem, the realization of my gifts, and the ability to bring those out into the world in ways that I can still do, has gone up. So I've trailed her growth by a matter of months or years, but the rising tide in her life has bounced back into my life. And simultaneously, because I'd never done that to that extent for anyone, been of service as an adult rather than the child's I need, the adolescent I want, appropriate for a child and adolescent, normal for a traumatized individual. That has given hope and insight and maturity that I didn't have before. At the same time, I have a map or a language of trauma, identity, and recovery that I didn't have before. And as that, so that has reached a point where it's, where there is an ascent financially, an ascent physically, an ascent psychologically, an ascent psychologically. There's also the physical integration, because in a state of high pain, I was, first of all, using tunnel vision with repetitive traumatic thoughts. And early on in that relationship, there was nothing to lean on, because you cannot lean on a regressed, highly traumatized individual. And I did not know if I had it in me to raise an adult while being in a regressed and traumatized state. And I could not do it to myself directly. I could not raise myself out of the traumatic regression into being an adult. So I was absolutely delighted that I could at least be helpful, to someone else. And then, around this time, not only my crew, started escalating. At one point, my bank account was down to like $4,000, and the crew forged a $4,000 check. And I went online while overseas trying to nurture this relationship, and I'm almost wiped out. And the helplessness and frustration of trying to deal with a sociopathic crew of employees that would steal, is just the last straw. And then dealing with the sociopathic nature of the visa process, they basically cost me most of that $200,000 by not allowing me to bring my wife into my own home, my own country. And so that's depressing income. At the same time, I'm not sure that I'll be able to create income. And so, the descent of betrayal of therapists, betrayal of friends, betrayal of family, betrayal of government, betrayal of employees, betrayal of culture, betrayal of country, in this state of invisibility where it's very difficult to release feelings when no one will hold or hear or understand them, because there's a deep drive to be seen, to exist. And it's one of the traps into, the compulsive thinking loops is if no one will acknowledge what a big deal this is, then I've got to remind myself, I've got to acknowledge what a big deal it is, but that strengthens the traumatic identity. There's a lot of catch-22s in this dynamic. And so, deep into antithesis, in order for a child to move from the innocence of accepting the status quo, accepting the authority figures and family and therapists and country and government, to become an adult, one has to realize and recognize the shadow side of country, culture, etc. And so I went deep into the antithesis of rebellion, which there's very little space for in our culture. We don't like someone who's arguing and doing devil's advocate and doing the antithesis and pointing out the shadow side and what's not unspoken. And so that lost me social rank at a time when I most needed support, becoming an adolescent, hating the world, hating my government, hating my family, hating the cult programs, hating who I was becoming in the absence of competent nurturing. And then hating more because I didn't like who I was becoming as someone who was filled with hate. The descent into the adolescent rebellion. And then moving from that, how do you move from an adolescent to an adult? Through love, through leadership, through tempering, and to finding a new world, a new synthesis of a unique perspective out of the unconditional yes of the child, the reactive no of the adolescent, to something that is able to negotiate with reality as it is and accept the good and the bad and work with the bad to make it better, etc. And around this time, my landlord, who has always been somewhat reactive, somewhat sociopathic, started pushing towards evicting me. And the stability of my home, this wasn't about rent. I don't know what it was about. I've never been late in rent in 15 years. But having my house and all of its stuff be taken away at the same time while things had not been put back together psychologically or socially or economically was absolutely terrifying. And so I appeased my landlord's abusive tendencies by tolerating and allowing it, as in, I'll take your abuse, just don't make me leave my home, which was an unhealthy trend that led to the first major physical injury of my life, breaking my radial head and scapal bone, bending over backwards to kind of kowtow to this landlord who, wouldn't spend a penny, would come over with used appliances that were breaking, without any help, and refused to do rational things, and so I'm trying not to set off his temper because he's an untrustworthy, unempathic human being in those types of situations. I dealt with that flare-up of his temper early on, and I understood that it was not a matter of law or fairness, that he would just dig in and attack someone if he felt threatened in any way, which was anyone standing up to him in any way. So there's this thing of which is more dangerous, standing up to an abusive authority and taking care of one's body, etc., or putting one's body at risk to appease a somewhat irrational authority that has this control over this sense of certainty, the stability of my home. And and so through the relationship, etc., that reached a point where I couldn't accept any more abuse from the landlord. And sure enough, as soon as I pointed out the legal rights and this and that, he had sent me an eviction notice within 4 hours. And just, could you actually do just a few of your many untended to landlord responsibilities? that you're legally responsible to do within a matter of months, not the normal 24 hours you'd expect any conscientious landlord to respond. And so that then set another explosion. Then we have coronavirus in the middle of that. Can I find a home? What's going to be coming at me next? And one of the godsends or the streaks of light that has come towards me, or that I found as a conscious benefit to all concerned to do, is to ask the question, what would bring the most happiness to my wife? And in other words, when I ask that question and act on it, not only does my wife become increasingly happy, but there's a ripple effect, meaning with a blown out algorithm for deciding what to do, meaning a map of reality that was obviously dysfunctional because we participate in our deterioration, we participate in our development. And so I had to acknowledge that I had chosen to associate with abusive people, which is also to acknowledge that I couldn't tell the difference, that I couldn't do something better, which is also to acknowledge that my algorithm for making decisions was harmful for my well-being. Now, that is a devastating realization when all you've got is your algorithm for making decisions. But I had noticed that a workaround was to apply rational, intuitive, and service-based energy to benefit my wife. And that when I did that, generally good things happened. And so I did more of that. So I was going to pick this other house to move towards, but this was my wife's favorite house, where I am right now. So it's like, I can't trust my algorithm. So we're going with what will make my wife the happiest. And so that led me to this house. And it's almost impossible to communicate any of these things to clients, because the American protocol is to avoid any smell of trauma. So if I explain to a client, I can't do this easily because of PTSD, and I can't do that easily because of PTSD, but I can do this. There's a narrow bandwidth through which I can meet your needs and function. And I've got to work within that bandwidth. Now, you will benefit greatly if you will work in that bandwidth with me, because within that bandwidth, I can function very highly, but we can't work at all outside of that bandwidth. Well, if someone was PTSD literate, this is very common sense. And, well, thank you for telling me, we'll do that. Clients in the US are not traumatically literate. And so that conversation can't happen. That's very stressful to know that there's, for the client, an invisible barrier that I can't go beyond. For me, it's a visceral barrier of massive amounts of pain. And so that, has created power dynamics that are uncomfortable with the client, for me and for them, because they sense that barrier, but they'll punish me if I talk about it, and they'll push me through the barrier if I don't structure the relationship in a certain way. So it's very uncomfortable. And so anyway, we moved into this house. It's an extra $1,000 in rent. It's a little bit further away, and it's in a neighborhood, and I wasn't sure how the neighbors are going to affect me, because it narrows to a certain extent my bandwidth of how I can play out and process and digest all this energy somewhat invisibly, because I've got 2 or 3 people, you know, in very close proximity, or different families and stuff. So that was stressful. But I made the move and consciously chose a landlord that, in talking with the tenant before them, was very responsive, you know, a very healthy dynamic. And thankfully, coronavirus did not negatively affect my business. It did a little bit in the first few months when they tried to shut down all activity. But then they wised up and understood that landscapers pose no risk to the general public, and you know, you're always 6 feet apart from the client and stuff anyway. And so work actually escalated thanks to being in the San Francisco Bay Area, where the tech sector is booming. Most of my clients with stock portfolios in the tech sector are seeing increases in wealth, even though the rest of the country is in various areas in the pits. So, you know, that's not about fair or anything else. It's just an awareness that my business has picked up. And the steady, rapid growth of my wife in a leadership position, as I had to fire my crew for, you know, just pushing the abuse and exploitation too far. And so I fired an abusive crew. I left an abusive landlord around the same time as my wife has been coming into her own with all of the fruits from all of that love and service and care and education and setup. And, you know, and what am I talking about? Well, learning to drive a car, learning to drive a truck, learning to drive a truck without crashing it, getting a driver's license, getting a visa. You know, all of these things are basic legwork to be able to receive any support. Because all that takes time and money, and when someone can't drive, they can't help in any way, and so that's kind of what I'm talking about in terms of fruits. And then there was also healing all the shame, because my wife, when she first came here, was ashamed to engage with Americans. With an inferiority complex that comes from traumatic childhood abuse in a national setting in which the United States has had somewhat of an abusive relationship with the Philippines, psychologically and otherwise, a superiority-inferiority complex. And so that needed context and time to discover how loved and appreciated she is, as opposed to, you know, how judged and discounted she is. So that has taken time. So all of those things kind of have been blossoming. And so as she's replaced the crew with a competent and ethical crew, the abuse is down, the fear is down, profits are up. And as profits are up, there's more of a cushion of savings, because I had to dip into my 401k at one point, bleeding it down to almost nothing, you know, just to survive. And so that's been able to be replenished, debts be paid off. I recently paid off $60,000 of debt in a matter of months. Well, that takes pressure off, and so again, rising up. Now, moving into the neighborhood, the house my wife chose has 12-foot tall ceilings, has enough space for us to do our own things, has enough space for her to have her own project room, has place for, for creativity, including this. This is enabled by space in the house, which is highly beneficial. We're talking end of August 2020 as I speak this. And it's beautiful. It is a beautiful house. I'm surrounded by beautiful houses and beautiful gardens. And so there's something uplifting in that. I'm close to nature. And that's where things have been moving. So I don't think I've ever, in California, had $200,000 of work signed up ahead of time while doing very well off the last $200,000 of work. So and as I've relaxed more because my fear is down, and developed other identities. I also started a nonprofit in that same direction of being in service. I've written a book on homelessness because, it's one of the things I'm very aware of, dealing with the type of PTSD that makes many people homeless and crazy. That my culture had increased the possibility and probability of me and people like me ending up in that situation of being homelessness. So I wrote a book about, the various aspects of how we create more homelessness in Marin County than I see anywhere in Thailand or Denmark or other healthy cultures. And so the ability to have the power of language, to be able to put this into words, something I couldn't have done as it was happening. Because when you're surrounded by a traumatically illiterate culture, no one articulates the science of trauma in themselves or in you. So there's no way to speak about it because it hasn't been modeled. There's no paradigm for it. I didn't even know what trauma was until a stranger in a cafe introduced me to the paradigm. And I realized that was the paradigm I was in without language to speak about it. So having language, deleting an abusive crew, deleting an abusive landlord, adding a healthy landlord, having a healthy wife. Then there was my dog, which I bought for my wife, to increase her well-being. But of course, it increased my well-being a good 20-25%. So another kind of effort to be of service coming back. So my dog, a new house, a new landlord, a new crew, and the space to create and dream. And then in the last few days, there have been tipping points that have pushed this metric over the point where I'm now more excited to get up in the morning and engage with life than I am to avoid it. So a lot of these engagements, whether with, the sociopathic visa epic of how to get your wife into your own country, if that's the United States. This is a sociopathic, hundreds and hundreds of pages, none of which have anything to do with love or anything else. The interview that we waited a year for took less than 3 minutes. When your government has a sociopathic attitude towards marriage or foreigners, depending on how you look at it, and holds up ability to cohabitate for a year, costing tens of thousands of dollars and all this, then you'd think they'd actually care about something enough to have done all that. But no, show up in Bangkok at 7 a.m. at this date or the whole process starts over again for this really important interview, right? Where they're going to decide, if this is a good marriage. 2 minutes. She's in, what's your name, what's this, bye, for nothing. You know, it's almost a joke. And it is a joke. It is easier to buy a dog in a foreign country and bring that dog into the country. Easy, 100 times easier than to marry someone you love and actually have them show up in your house. Insane? Yes. Cruel? Yes. Difficult? Yes. And so, having gone through all of that, in pain, every single minute of looking at these insanities, tax money being used to make my life worse at the worst possible time. It's not fun. It's not pretty. It's disgusting. How do you engage with life when it disgusts you? And that's where being able to have a bird's eye view and look back and say, well, it takes things in the right direction, tediously, helplessly, with uncertainty, no guarantee of success. But if it all works out, it will be a little better, probably, than if it doesn't. So we got to take these steps, and now these steps, now these steps. And just working to a point where rather than shifting my sleep every day to have a jet lag to numb the pain, to a point where I could get up when I wanted to get up. That took several years. So anyway, and then just before I moved house, cigar smoking, which had become part of that addictive identity, as a way to numb out. Cigar smoking and YouTube watching, definitely a good survival strategy, but the toxicity built up in my body to a point where my body was in enormous pain smoking a cigar. So I had to stop. But that was right about the time I was moving into the new house. So as that numbing wore off, there was something nice to see. Beautiful arches, magnificent paint colors, magnificent plants and gardens. And so, you don't want to take off the anesthetic when someone's sawing away at your body. And that's what a lot of my life has felt like these last few years. I wanted the anesthetics because the pain was unbearable, even as I understood that the anesthetics were killing me off moment by moment by moment. They were still making it bearable to be present and navigate reality. And so since moving here without cigars, in an ability to go through the day without numbing, with clients that, as I've been recovering, have become more and more favorable, thank goodness, leading to better and better references, etc., leading to, as I sit here, $200,000 of work is scheduled, from September to next spring. So that gives security in identity, in a positive identity, which work collapsed when I had been overseas so long. And then coming back enraged at my government for, almost capsizing my business, etc. It's not a very good attitude and energy through which to restart a business. And so I've been in the country now for most of a couple of years now, taking step by step to do the things that reestablish a business. And so that is coming in kind of a positive cycle backwards. And then the fact that I've endured way more pain than I'm in today and survived gives a certain level of confidence. Not necessarily that I won't create that pain again, but that I actually can live through it, which I didn't know at the time because it was a new threshold of pain. And physically and psychologically. So so those are positive trends. But the real kind of lifting out came with my landlord in the last house when the refrigerator went out. Right after I'd gotten married and needed the whole use of a normal size refrigerator, replaced the old full-size refrigerator with a refrigerator 30% smaller without consulting me, and then started putting all kinds of pressure and threats around swapping the fridge out. And at the time I felt poor because I still didn't know if I would survive, and so money becomes more tight. And the landlord during this period raised the rent $800, which again, fear, not wonderful. So quality of house going down, rent going up $800, and bullying continuing. And my neighbors in my last house were not friendly neighbors. Efforts to reach out were met with distance and rejection over a 15-year period. And this was depressing. No neighbors, no good landlord, no family, therapists participating in sexual abuse under the influence of psychedelics, pain going up, it's just so miserable. And so moving to this house, one of the first people to greet me was the young girl next door called Paige. And she was the friendliest neighbor that I've encountered in 15 years in the old house. So my first neighbor is warm. Then other neighbors across the street are warm and hospitable. You have no idea what a psychological relief it is to know that I'm actually in a neighborhood that feels like a neighborhood I want to be in, rather than wanting to be in a neighborhood and being in the exact opposite. So the neighborhood surprised me. 15 years of unwelcome neighbors in the past house led me to have an idea of the American neighborhood in California as being a picture of that, just like abusive parents lead to the idea of everyone's an abusive authority figure, which of course doesn't bring out one's best side when one expects to be rejected, abused, lied to, etc. It doesn't bring out your best side, and then that doesn't bring out the best side in other people. But I had the good fortune, thanks to picking the house my wife wanted to pick, of ending up in a neighborhood that is 350% warmer and more friendly than the neighborhood that I was in but didn't want to be in. So that lifts one level of social pain. I'd been feeling fear and tight about a refrigerator for over a year, worried about upsetting my abuser. And today, I bought the nicest refrigerator I've ever seen. I didn't know that refrigerators were this nice. The one downside of this new house was it was the noisiest refrigerator I'd ever experienced. It had two distinct noises. One, a groaning noise, and that variability meant that I couldn't tune it out. Because a typical fan noise, you may hear it, but it's a continual noise, so you tune it out rapidly. I couldn't tune out the noise of this fridge. And I'm also, part of this is moving through the dynamic of, from the child, the abused child who's afraid to die if no one will take care of them. That's a regressed, traumatized child. to the angry adolescent who experiences being rejected and judged, etc., for being angry about it, right? I've been moving slowly towards the adult, which I've learned is situational. You can be a child with one person. You have to go through the abused child dynamic with that person into the antithesis, the rejection of the adolescent, and then you can relate to that person as an adult, seeing them for who they are, pluses and minuses, seeing myself for who I am, pluses and minuses, and, making it work. And it occurred to me, I don't need to have, thanks to the work, thanks to the growing security, the proof that I can function in this level of pain, years to prove it, I can depend on myself to create an income with my wife that is going up, meaning debt payment is $80,000 less in just 1 year. Income is 100% to 200% more at the same time. And there's probability of continuance at the same time, what has become, a core strength, the marriage and my wife. So when I met my wife, she would collapse into 2-year-old regression periodically, have tantrums. As her coping strategy in a situation growing up where she couldn't depend on anyone. Those are almost non-existent because I applied PTSD protocols in the relationship to heal her PTSD. And so I actually have an adult large sections of the time. And that's becoming more of an adult every single month. I remember when she'd make a mistake driving, she would just say, I'm never going to drive again. I'm not interested. I'm not going to practice. And it's like, I'm going to be left taking care of a child forever at a time I can barely be an adult for myself, to now she's having fun, driving a full-size truck, enjoying herself. Confidence comes with experience. She's had a couple of years of being rewarded again and again and again with experience and with growth. And it's it's wonderful to see her enjoying challenge and overcoming it again and again, and bringing that strength to our marriage, to our family, to our finances, to our client relationships, to our crew relationship, because she is a natural leader, were it not for the levels of abuse that she experienced. And of course, I'm also, grateful. So, of course, when you've grown up around New Age psychology, etc., one of the easy and unfortunate aspects of that is what's called the spiritual critic. Because when you know all the things that you're supposed to be feeling to be a spiritual person and are supposed to be doing to be a spiritual person, but you're doing the exact opposite and feeling the exact opposite, it just adds shame and frustration to the dynamic. I haven't felt grateful. It's like I wake up and can I get through the day, let alone, feel grateful, have a gratitude diary. It's like that just is enraging in that state. And so the amazing thing over, the last month in particular, which is how long we've been in this house, is gratitude is natural and easy because I'm in a context and an environment in which there's less and less pain and more things to be grateful for in that garden, gratitude comes out spontaneously. No need for the spiritual critic to hammer away of be grateful and do this, etc. It happens naturally in a state of grace. And I didn't know that would ever happen, in all of this. The literature on PTSD is inconclusive. You cannot take an American with PTSD in this type of terrain to any therapist or any location and have guaranteed success. You could have $100,000 and hire the panel of the leading authors. They don't actually work very well, and sometimes make things worse. The technology and the science of trauma is underdeveloped, to put it mildly. And so that's one of the things you learn in the research. It's not just like go to this institute and you'll be cured. It's go to this institute and you'll spend a lot of money and time, and it could be worse, and this will be difficult, and this is suboptimal, and you'll get, it works very well 30% of the time, but maybe not. Or if you're close to going bankrupt and you spend a lot of money going to this place and take time off work, you could be cured and come back bankrupt and then have a new trauma about being bankrupt in a culture that shames you for being poor. And so there's no easy path for our veterans and things, and people who are dealing with this issue, and that's maddening to understand that this has been going on for hundreds of years in our culture, and we turn a blind eye, and we're spending less money developing and applying trauma protocols to our people than we are developing new iPad apps to addict people to advertisements so they'll buy things they don't want. I mean, that's insane. And that's, to grasp the insanity of one's cult does not inspire gratitude. It's hair-pulling frustration and depression. And so in the last month, space increase 30%, beauty increase 100%, neighbors increase 350%. And driving around this neighborhood is one beautiful surprise after another. The beautiful walks on the bay looking at nature. The one nice new neighbor after another. Someone just invited me over for every Friday night neighborhood gathering. Never happened in 15 years. In my other neighborhood, I tried to organize a neighborhood gathering. Nobody was interested. Here I'm invited to one within a few weeks of arriving with warmth. Now, I mean, so it's just one surprise of a positive nature after another. So that social increase in expectation and experience. I just gave a radio control sailboat to the lovely kids next door, and didn't have to deal with any of the awkwardness around giving expensive gifts or anything. They just loved it and received it, and their parents loved it and received it. And so that's another frustration culturally. When you have shame around money and stuff, giving something sometimes produces shame in the person you're giving to, which isn't the desired effect. And so then I discovered 50 artists are a few blocks away from me, working in the kind of art community I had only seen in Thailand before. So I would visit Thailand, and then I'd visit this art community in Thailand, and I'd say, why can't I have that in America? Why can't I be in an artist community there? You know, maddening. Here it is, an artist community. And the restaurant just up the road in this park-like setting, incredible staff, getting to know, the whole thing is idyllic. There's actually a church I may want to visit right up the road, somewhat of a Unitarian type, church. There's spaces to fly my radio-controlled planes without pissing people off. Tons of space. It's just, Americans are very, very touchy about all kinds. You don't do this here and here. There's a sense of some space and freedom there. Surviving the move, of course, which I was afraid of, financially and otherwise, and discovering that I have more money in my bank account a month later due to an influx of work that began right about the time of the move, rather than work drying up and feeling I can't afford the home. And so then there was a new chiropractor. I had been rejected by 4 chiropractors because they didn't want to talk about trauma while they were moving my body, which would bring up traumatic memories. They would all say the same thing: I'm not a trauma person and I don't have time for that. Well, everyone is a trauma person in a traumatized cult, 1. And 2, you're a chiropractor, for goodness sake. What happened to this holistic approach? If people cannot integrate their thoughts and their feelings while you're moving their body, that's not holistic medicine. It's dissociation. 4 chiropractors rejected me for wanting to integrate awareness of trauma. Just up the road, this chiropractor takes up to an hour while adjusting my body to talk through and deal with what's coming up. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of percent. We're dealing with 1,000% improvement in protocol and intelligence in that one step. An American that has time to talk about important traumatic things. So it's one thing after another. Then, I had some help with a Thai healer, which brought things to a certain point on this journey. And I've been able to retain a lot of that. I've reconnected and done some more work with the channel Lazarus, and somewhat gone through the adolescent rebellion, etc., with the parent company Concept Synergy, which, as it turns out, traumatizes and abuses their employees. I've interviewed 4 of them, and it's maddening to see channeled luminosity being correlated with severe work abuse and shaming. That's our version of metaphysics and spirituality. We're a trauma illiterate cult. You don't spend a single hour in the entire education or parental system learning a single thing about trauma or traumatic recovery. We bully our trauma survivors because they're usually the most frightening and fearful. And that's what we attack in our culture. We attack the symptom rather than going at the cause, and is, again, frustrating. So, but being able to differentiate the abuses of the parent company with the underlying meditations and information, and not having to throw it all out as part of the movement from the child relationship with kind of the God figure, parental figure, to the adolescent rebellion, to actually be able to receive good bits without being blind to the bad bits as an adult. So I would say that I'm becoming an adult, which is a phenomenal thing. I didn't know really what that was until age 40, what an adult was, because no one particularly modeled it, and there weren't even any good definitions. Having a car doesn't change your state. So becoming an adult, having an amazing wife, moving into an amazing home, having less abusive clients and abusing myself less addiction, more enjoyment of life. Then I bought a stereo to listen to music that I bought when I was 12 to 20 years old, my CD collection, which I haven't listened to in years, and enjoying that in one of the nicest rooms the nicest room that's ever been my bedroom, and bringing my art, my crystal sculptures and things into that room and being able to integrate that, feeling space for what's sacred to me. Another plus. So so discovering all of this in 1 month and learning that to change and to blossom and to say no to abuse leads to something better rather than a downward spiral, that's possible, and that my track record is showing that I can do that, even if it's indirectly, in the sense, how can I make my wife happy? Just knowing that works. Knowing that if I want my life to continue to get better, I can ask that question, thoughtfully take it to a deep level, and be of service to another human being. And then be in the presence of that human being as they blossom and grow. And that this feeds my well-being, gives me a reason to live, is liberating. And so that's all coming to a head in a month. And it's exciting. My skills have also been growing in this terrain. My respect is that as those skills are growing, has gone up. So, and then today, as we're flushing out the garden, buying beautiful plants, setting up the house to be more comfortable and more beautiful than any house that I've ever lived in, watching my wife enjoy herself in her dream house, and with the most quiet. I mean, this fridge is incredible. It has more space than I've ever had, which is nice for two people with different diets. I'm vegetarian. Filipinos like meat and rice with every dish, or every meal. Bigger than any fridge I've ever seen, more nicely organized, because it's the only one that I've never gone fridge shopping. So the quietest fridge on the market, and with 3 separate doors. One little door for drinks and all the immediate things, then a whole thing for the fridge, then the whole thing for the freezer, water and ice with a filter, a brand new reverse osmosis filter for the sink. And we're just, making things better every single week and feeling the abundance and the certainty that we're on an upward draft. That just as the downward draft, when your therapist abuses you, you lose trust in therapists. So now you don't have therapists to help you fix the abuse of the other therapist, and costs go up, and income goes down, and attitude goes down, and nobody understands. It's a downward spiral. So this is an upward spiral. And I have a lot of gratitude for my rational brain that has steered decisions based on data-based psychology and research and self-awareness each step of the way. That over a 4 years of meeting my wife, over a 4-year period, my life has stabilized, gotten better. New identities have formed and are forming. And I'm in a beautiful space in which to continue to leverage that in new and exciting and creative ways. This is my best studio I've ever been for recording anything since I've gotten into recording a few years ago. So I've got the best studio and can start collaborating. It's just really, it's beyond my expectation. And the huge point is realizing that I have crossed the point where I don't have to steel myself. I don't have to cringe and say, this is going to hurt. You know, when you've wounded yourself and you apply the antiseptic, it stings, but you've got to do it. And when you've wounded yourself in the wilderness and you've got to get back to civilization, every step is painful while that wound heals. But you got to do it or you die in the wilderness. And I've been steeling myself for 4 years to take each step that had to be done to have some chance of rationally seeing things better. And with a great many of those steps, things got a little bit better and a little bit better, but the pain was still much worse than well-being. And to reach a point where I understand I'm past that, where my mind is actually waking up, where I want to be in my body. I want to see tomorrow, and I want to see next month more than this month, and the month after that, where possibilities of a positive nature are expanding. It's reversing the dying of my brain. Because the first thing to go was memories. They were too painful. I lost the ability to speak coherently in segments of my segments of my psyche. Because to put that into language was too difficult. It would wipe me out for a day just to look at a certain thought, etc. So it became scary to look inside. To go from that to this point of liberation is incredible. And to understand that the trajectory that I'm co-creating is producing that. And that is something that I can continue, is incredible as well, because I now have a map that works 70%. That's enough to get me there. With trial and error in the 30% that's fuzzy and painful and doesn't work. But it's enough. If you keep going at something, if you make enough bets and 70% of them pay off, you just take $100 and you bet 100 times. And if 70% of them double money, now you got 140 minus the 30 loss. Then you place another 100 bets. Now it's close to 300 with the loss. And another one. It's an upward climb. And I'm so grateful. I'm grateful to my wife. I'm grateful to the field. I'm grateful to the neighborhood. I'm grateful to the culture that's created the neighbors. I'm grateful for the protocol that's led me here. I'm grateful for my room. I'm grateful for my music. I'm grateful for the clients for taking $100,000 bets on me. And I'm excited about the world and where I'm going.